Alright, so back in like March, I want to say March 13th it might have been, is when the industry took a pretty big blow when we lost William Hurt, who had, mostly smaller parts and was playing kind of side characters for a while towards the end there, but obviously when you look back on it, was a really, really big deal, especially this whole run in the 80s that he had is insane. So I kind of just wanted to go through because there were 7 years in the 80s where he had something come out, and I just want to use like 7 videos here that we're going to have where we talk about each year that he had in the 80s and just talk about those movies in general and him in them and all that other stuff. But just to really kind of highlight the impact that he had, especially at the beginning of his career. And when I decided to do this, for some reason, I know, and I've known forever, that his very first movie was Altered States. And for some reason, it just never occurred to me until right up to the time I was getting ready to prepare this of, oh shit, that's a big thing to open on. That's a big thing to just kind of come out of the gate with. Because I'm sure there are people that know this movie front to back, maybe even Chayefsky's novel front to back, and so much stuff that this touches on. I feel kind of unqualified to go into this. I'm gonna just try my best on Altered States, but yeah, it's a very intimidating way to start because there's so much here, but I guess we'll just see what happens, and then we'll go through and I think the next year after this, Body Heat and Eyewitness both came out, so the next video will be those two together, and so on through the 80s. I don't know if I'm calling this anything, if I'm just going to put it under the reviews. I was toying with the idea of calling it Hurting for the 80s, but I don't know if I'm going to stick with that or not. I guess you'll find out once this is out. But yeah, so to celebrate this massive, massive talent and his massive career, let's go through his 80s run and start with Older. I think the only thing, actually, that won't be here is A Time of Destiny, which was in 88 with The Accidental Tourist, and I don't think you can find it really anywhere. All the stuff I've tried to look it up with is just people saying how hard it is to find. So maybe at the very end of this, at the last minute, I might find it, but that might be the only thing that's missing. But otherwise, we're going to go through his whole 80s run. So now we can start with Altered States, which almost seems like it could have been an absolute disaster in the making, because we do have Chayefsky adapting his own novel, but we also have who seems to be the perfect choice for something like this, directing, which is Ken Russell, whose movies always had this really sort of trippy vibe to them, and he was really controversial at the time for how far he was willing to go outside of the box, and what he was willing to show and the way he portrayed things, but also the way in which he would do adaptations, but really off-book adaptations. And with Chayefsky, it's everything feels really precise in his dialogue and just the writing in general. So it almost just seems like this was always meant to be a disaster, but somehow, even though they didn't get along and Chayefsky took his name off the script, obviously the novel's still credited to him, but he went under a pseudonym for the script credit, it somehow still managed to turn into something that is an experience all its own. When you talk about movies that kind of get influenced by other things, especially in this era, it might give off the vibe that it was too heavily influenced by the fact that, when you look at, sci-fi movies of the era, when we get to the opening scene and the opening credits are very Alien-esque, but then it's just totally its own thing after that. Starting with this opening shot in the tank, where it's the way they shoot this, and it's just interesting how right away this movie has a way of using its visuals to get its point across, which is something that you'll see throughout the whole thing. And it's what always got me about this opening scene in the tank is the way we get that shot from underneath, and it's where he's clearly vertical, but this shot almost makes it look like it's horizontal, like he's laying down, and it's the idea of it almost being disorienting right then and there, that it's giving you the feeling of once you're in this tank, and just how all sort of perception goes out the window. And obviously that's actually before he even starts having visions once he's in the tank, and then that gives us the whole... It's a movie that really puts us in the perspective of this character throughout really well, and I feel like that's what one of its biggest strengths are, and you would think that'd be something very hard to do for the things that happen in this movie, but he somehow managed... They all somehow managed to pull it off. What I also think this movie does really well as far as putting you in the perspective is the fact that it's interesting that it's a movie about, you know, a character that's studying schizophrenia, and how it makes sense for this movie to have multiple perceptions to itself, I guess you could say, where it's like, for a long time, from like scene to scene to scene, it almost feels like a different movie with every new scene, where we get stuff like, we get that opening scene, but then we get like this sweet romance that starts happening between him and Emily, and then it's like, you feel like you're watching this sort of, it almost could be the start of a romance movie or a romantic comedy or something, and then we get maybe one of the most jarring cuts to a sex scene, maybe in movie history, but then the way this sex scene actually portrays, like it's the foreshadowing of us being in, like, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, the sort of primal way we can go back to in the heat of the moment, I guess you could say. Where it's like when you really think about sex to its details, and how kind of weird the whole act is, and how almost caveman-like the whole act is, and how our brains sort of go to this very basic state. But then, on the opposite end of that, there's this sort of enlightenment afterwards, I guess you could call it. So it's like after he's in that primal state and we have this sex scene, then suddenly we have this moment where he goes into this riveting monologue about like his dad's last moments, and then like his relationship with God and all that. And like I said, it's really just these scenes that seem like they're completely separated, completely disjointed, yet somehow feel like they're the perfect representation of what this whole movie is talking about and what it's going into, and what will inevitably happen as we get farther into the story. And then, on top of another riveting monologue, because what's really interesting about this being Hurt's first movie is that, obviously he comes from the he went to Juilliard, and then he had this, you know, good run in the 70s just being in the theater, and it's like, how does one get cast in a movie like this from the theater? And it's like, when you look at these monologues, it's clear, it seems like they intentionally said it. I want to say, it was actually Chayefsky that chose William Hurt and Blair Brown, I think. And like, to see him do these, you can tell it's somebody that's sort of still young, but also somewhat of a veteran to the theater at this point, that he's able to deliver these monologues. And then we get this moment at the bar where he delivers this drunk monologue where he's going through the whole thing about, I get the way that I interpret it, which is the layers that he sort of talks about with the whole true self thing, where like our true self sort of goes through layers and then ultimately comes out as something else completely different on the other side, like a game of telephone or something, and then like kind of coming back to that in this whole theory that he's trying to do. And it also kind of makes me think of like memories, where you think about like something happens and then you remember that thing, but it's like, when you read up on it, and how like every time you remember that thing, it's not the same memory that it was, even though they might seem identical in your mind. It's never going to be the same memory every time, and then by then how you remember something can be totally different. And I think the reason my mind jumps to memories for comparison there is there's the scene when he comes to the party at the beginning, and when he shows up and the door opens and it's like this really bright hallway and he's at the end of it. A scene that we mirror in a dark way towards the end after everything has happened, and he reaches that other side. But that shot almost feels like a memory, and is like how memories get exaggerated as they go. And it almost feels like this shot is like a memory grown exaggerated of when Emily first saw him walk into the party, and it almost feels like dreamlike now. Talk about stuff that I don't quite know about, that's very crucial to this movie, is the big scene, the trip scene, that really sends him down this path and really gets him going. As far as the portrayal of a trip and being on a drug and stuff like that, I've never done any type of drug in my entire life, so I kind of have to just go on assumption. But based on that assumption, I feel like this scene is a very vivid interpretation of what a trip might be like. Like, if I had to guess, I would assume um, this is pretty close to what it would feel like. And the easy comparison to make would be it does feel like a scene out of the end of 2001. But there's still something here also where it's like not only is because the idea I think the reason that I haven't ever tried drugs in my life is that I find it very scary, the idea of not being in complete control of your mind. The way that it starts to get really scary, but also kind of enlightening, but also, and it's just like every emotion all at once, like happiness, sadness, fright, maybe a little bit of disgust even. But then there's the point where everything starts to come down to ash, and it's like I get that feeling that it's like it starts off really really intense, and then there's that sort of coming down feeling where, and once again, just everything kind of coming back down, just to a very basic state, to basically a state of nothingness. And then also the way the sound goes completely silent in that moment also, it's just really haunting in this way. But like I said, also I can only imagine really portrays that whole starting at the intensity and then coming through feeling all the emotions, and then it's just like kind of nothing. Is really really satisfying on a cinematic level. Even if I don't really know for sure about the interpretation of a drug-induced trip or whatever. But then obviously this gets us in the direction of him going into the tank and trying to find this, first state of being, this first true self. And I do think what I really like about this moment, the first time we sort of see the tank, is the way the light is reflecting off of it. Sort of makes it accidentally look like almost like a sonogram, like something in the womb. Of course, they really take to this image. They really go all in on that imagery towards the end when he goes into like a full transformation. But I like this moment especially because it looks like it's by accident, which I really appreciate. So yeah, and then of course it becomes another movie entirely, like it has been the whole time, where it's like every other scene feels like it's a different movie at this point. Now we go full blown horror movie. You could say there's horror elements to the trip scene also, but when it goes full transformation, body horror, stuff like that, like it's very interesting to me that we were talking about how, oh, you could think it's trying to be Alien with the opening credits, and then it starts to feel like something like an American Werewolf in London. But this movie actually predates American Werewolf in London by 1 year. It was the very next year the American Werewolf in London came out. So this kind of has that feeling early on of like where it almost feels like a werewolf movie. It just happens to be an ape of sorts. And yeah, as soon as that jump scare happens, yeah, it feels like we're in a new movie. But at the same time, you could say, because it's very interesting, because I actually I really vividly remember the stuff before this, before the movie turns into this. Now that I'm older, whereas when I was younger, the only thing I really remembered about this movie was this portion, the sort of horror movie, werewolf-esque portion. But what's really interesting about that now is that it doesn't even necessarily feel like it's, a whole massive part. Like, it doesn't feel like the whole movie was building up to this so that this could be the movie. It really just feels like the whole portion of him, turning into essentially a monster and running around, feels like just an extended payoff to what we've had previously, where it's like everything before this is the movie, and then this is just kind of the payoff afterwards when it kind of goes full-blown horror. There's, like, we talked about the dark hallway shot, there's even the moment where we have, like, the long take that's from outside the windows, where it's like she's being watched, and it's like, it really feels like it goes full horror movie. A direction that Russell has been down a time or two. And the way that somehow translates to where we started, and how it doesn't really feel like it loses its way, despite the fact that it seems to go through so many genres. But like I said, it feels like that's completely the point, because of where this all started. And like I said, the idea of studying schizophrenia and the multiple perceptions and all that, it makes perfect sense that this movie is tonally the way that it constantly shifts. And then as far as the very end, our sort of conclusion here, is something that I always found kind of hard to read because I feel like it's too easy to go the route, and we know with Interstellar that when you're doing like sci-fi movies, people do not apparently like the conclusion that love conquers all. But I do feel like there's something in there about that. But I think it's also just in general when we talk about the primal nature of things and how it's like one of the things we really desire most in life is having another person, like having that other half to us that another person will bring to us, and finding that love of sorts. And so when we get to this ending shot, and that's what sort of brings them out of this, it does make sense. In the fact that they're both naked feels like it's an Adam and Eve thing, also, where it's like it's coming back to the very beginning is also symbolic of that as well, which might be the main point they're going for, because it is all about coming back to the beginning as the whole setup, the whole concept. But yeah, so that's about the best I think I can do as far as trying to interpret altered states as far as me personally, without having really read up on much of other like I'm sure there's essays upon essays on this movie and the material and stuff like that. Like I said, I'm just kind of here to do this William Hurt series and talk about how great his 80s run was and how amazing an actor he was right out of the gate, like from the get-go, and taking what he clearly learned from the stage and theater and bringing it into this role. That's very cinematic, but also has those moments where he gets to have those big monologues. These monologues that are really selling what it is this movie's trying to say and trying to convey. And it's this really wild, insane, trippy ride of a movie that has that opens up a lot of interesting doors and a lot of interesting things to think about, and just kind of going down those sort of rabbit holes in your mind. So the kind of stuff where if you're laying in bed at 2 in the morning and you can't sleep, this, and your mind just goes all these places, this will be, one of those things that comes up. It's like going all the way back, and it's like how we started, and then where we are now, and yeah, it's wild. And the fact that if we were to be able to go back to that, we would essentially be living a horror movie, sounds about right. So, I would say all of this interpreted that quite well. Like I said, with my limited, unqualified knowledge of what the hell is going on here, so I feel like that's the best I can do. So, like I said, the next thing I think we're going to talk about is Body Heat and Eyewitness, and then we'll go down this for 7 videos, and then that'll be that, and this will be in between us doing like the remake verses and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think that's all I've got for this, so if you want to add anything else, please, by all means, feel free. Like I said, there's just endless possibilities in talking about this stuff. So, and the movie, I feel like, especially in the opening scenes, conveys that pretty well also with the monologues and stuff like that. So, and the way he's trying to convey this to the other people, like at the bar and stuff like that. And it's like you can either dismiss him as crazy, or you can kind of go down that path and see, and explore and see what the hell you find on the other side. So, that's always fun. So, I guess we'll leave this at that. So until the next thing, I think that's it.